Thank you for coming and for taking this block to come be with me while we go over this sort of queer and trans history of games. So as an introduction, I just wanted to introduce myself and kind of talk a bit about what I'll be going over during this talk block. First off, I'm Whitney Pow. I am a queer, transgender, and non-binary scholar of color. My pronouns are they, them. I'm currently a PhD at Northwestern University, and next year I will be joining New York University as an assistant professor of queer and transgender media studies. It's just so exciting to see the fact that like queer and trans media and queer and trans histories of media and video games and technology is becoming more and more acknowledged and more present, just as evidenced by seeing all of you here especially, so thank you. So I'm both a scholar and historian and also a game designer. So this talk will kind of reflect both of those aspects of my expertise. The first part of this talk will consist of The Glitch, Queer and Transgender Software History, where I will locate 3 queer trans women and their contributions to video game history: Jamie Faye Fenton, Cathryn Mataga, and Danielle Bunten Berry. If you attended the brilliant talk that Kevin and Rachel gave earlier today, The Arcadians, you'll see that my history of Jamie Faye Fenton and glitch art actually overlaps with their history of the Balliastrocade. So there's a lot of really interesting resonances that are happening here in terms of queer and trans game history, and also like homebrew and communities and like home computer and video game consoles. And then the second part is a demonstration of a video game I designed about Jamie Faye Fenton, and this is titled Digital TV Breakfast, as a play with her video art piece, Digital TV Dinner. This game that I designed, that I'll be showing, I exhibited this year at Ars Electronica in Linz, Austria, at the as a part of the art exhibition, Chicago New Media Art, 1973 to 1992. All right, so let's get started. So thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here. My talk focuses on how 3 queer trans women imagined futures and alternative uses for video games in the 1970s and 80s. Jamie Faye Fenton, Cathryn Mataga, and Danielle Bunten Berry were software programmers who developed programs for video game consoles and computers. The programs they designed include operating systems for combination video game and home computer consoles, text parsing languages for interactive fiction games, and networked online multiplayer games. The games that Fenton, Mataga, and Bunten Berry were asked to design contained rule sets and predetermined possibilities for how users could use them. In their work, however, these 3 women destabilized the known, the algorithmic, and the programmatic in their games as a mode of resistance to the rigid systems of thought shared by computational technologies and the newly emerging use of computers as systems of surveillance. These women engaged with what Bunten Berry called people orientations toward the human in video game technologies that centered the possibility of an outside to the algorithmic, an outside to the computational, the cherishing of human error in video games and computational media. In my book project, People Orientations Toward a Queer and Transgender Software History, and I absolutely love people orientations, it's just such a brilliant kind of term, I am looking for the people who came before me, who could give me the evidence that so many of us need, that queer and trans lives can be long and full and well-lived. A few months ago, November 20th, was Trans Day of Remembrance. Trans women of color, and especially Black and Indigenous trans women, face a disproportionate amount of fatal violence in the United States, with 22 transgender or gender nonconforming people fatally shot or killed by other violent means in 2019. We need queer and trans video game history to ground us in what we know is true, that queer and trans people have always been a part of our pasts, and that their presences and innovations still move with us and affect our everyday interactions with games today. I write this history with particular attentiveness to the way queer and transgender life has been written about in video game history. These histories locate queer and trans life as a blip on the radar, an anomaly, an interesting singular case study, rather than a continuous line that demonstrates that queer and trans people have always been here, changing the way we imagine our relationship to computation and games. Narratives of technological innovation often reimagine and reinvent themselves as a forward push toward new and better, so-called new and better futures for all, when in fact we must be aware of the fact that digital media technologies, including video games, have had the capability to reinforce and reproduce institutional and surveillance logics that have pervaded the history of computers. When we bring together the necessary material and historical context for the video games that Fenton, Bunten Berry, and Mataga produced during this period, we might be able to better see the futures and possibilities they imagined for themselves in the video games and software they programmed. They imagined the possibility of trans life exceeding the predetermined limits of computational systems. They imagined a freedom from the scripts and protocols within games. They imagined trans life outside of the limits of the computational. Jamie Faye Fenton, The Glitch. In 1979, the Chicago public broadcasting station WTTW aired its 10th one-hour episode of the video art program Image Union. The episode's theme was animation. Among the experimental video art exhibited in this episode were hand-drawn cartoons, stop-motion art, and computer image video. At 36 minutes and 36 seconds into the program, Digital TV Dinner by Jamie Fenton airs. It begins with a voiceover by Professor Tom DeFanti. Quote, "This piece represents the cheapest one can go in home computer art," he says. "This involves taking a $300 video game system and pounding it with your fist so the cartridge pops out while it's trying to write the menu." And I wanted to show you what this piece looked like.
The music here is done by Dick Ainsworth using the same system, but pounding it with your fingers instead of your fist.
Mute this as I continue speaking, but you can kind of watch the sort of flow of the video happening. What is on display is stunning, an array of blocky artifacts that loop and cascade down the screen like waterfalls, the video cutting between different textures of pixels arranged in an ever-changing array of patterns. These images were generated by creating software errors or glitches in the Bally Astrocade home game console and computer by removing a software or game cartridge while the console itself was processing, which could result in a visual software glitch that could last anywhere from half a second to 10 seconds long. Fenton was the software lead for the Bally Astrocade and designed its operating system. In a talk she gave last year at Gallery 400 in Chicago, she says that she made a fateful decision when designing the hardware. One of them was making the video that came out of the Astrocade NTSC legal, an analog broadcast standard for television, quote, so it could be recorded on any video cassette recorder, and secondly, quote, to put in buffers or an integrated circuit that made the interface robust enough that you could insert or remove the cartridge while a game was on, which allowed the console to create visible software errors or glitches in the Astrocade's interface. This year, I visited the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, to do research in the archives. And shout out to Andrew Borman, who helped me out with the archives there. When I turned on the museum's Bally Astrocade for the first time, the first screen I saw was a glitch. A grid of offset rectangles tiled together, a visual indicator of the software errors that were happening in the hidden lines of code within the console itself. Fenton's decision to make all of the image output legible and able to be recorded and archived by a VCR allowed for the existence of Digital TV Dinner, a collection of software errors she generated by hand and stitched and edited together into the final 2 minutes and 41-second video. In a video Fenton published in August 2018 titled Primordial Glitch Art, she demonstrates how the glitch was made using her own home Bally arcade console. In the video, she sits at what looks like her home office. She says, "What I do is I take one of these cartridges, I insert it into a slot here, and press reset. And then I'll split the cartridge out. You'll see you get a glitch." She faces the TV in her office, watching the digital artifacts appear on the menu screen for about half a second. "Depending on how lucky you are, you get different types of glitches," she says. After producing a few 1 to 2 second glitches, a long series of pixels, lines, and blocks flows down the screen over and over like the movement of a waterfall or the steps of a slinky as it moves down the stairs. Fenton turns briefly to the camera. "Not sure what we did to deserve that one. That one's great," she says. And I wanted to show the video that she made. And this is also available to look at on YouTube.
Hello. What I'm doing is demonstrating how glitch art was done in the late 1970s. What I'm using here is a Bally Astrocade computer hooked up to a TV, tuned to channel 3. And what I do is I take one of these cartridges and I insert it into the slot here. There's one here called a blackjack. Put that one in the slot. I press reset, and then I'll usually go enter into the cartridges thing, and then spit the cartridge out. You see, you get a glitch. Let's do a few more of these. Depending on how lucky you are, you get different types of glitches. That one wasn't particularly interesting, but you see what I'm doing is I work the user interface here, make some selection, and then at some point while the code's actually executing in the game, I spit the cartridge out by pressing the eject button. You see, you get different types of glitches, different circumstances. Sometimes it just resets just like that. Other times it makes things even more interesting. Yeah, there's an example. Let's go find some other games and try those. There's one called Star Battle. Let's see if that one does. Woo, there we go. That's kind of a cool little glitch. Not sure what we did to deserve that one, but that one's great because that one just goes on and on and on. Anyway, let's see. Hello.
So one of the things I love about this video is just you see how much labor went behind making digital TV dinner. The fact that many of these glitches only last maybe a second or two, and then occasionally you get that like cascading 5-second glitch, and it's just so lovely how she treats it like it's a gift. And it's just the idea of the error as being a gift, I think, is just a beautiful thing to take from that clip. Okay, digital TV dinner is a collection of software failures. It is, as Michael Betancourt writes, not a use of software, it is a record of technical failure. These images are a result of the digital processor glitching after the program running is unexpectedly interrupted. Fenton approaches the video game console with complete uncertainty about what the images or effects will be produced. There is something lovely about the way she says it in the video, "Not sure what we did to deserve that one," as if this interruption and error she produces in the software she herself built could create something completely strange and new and unpredictable. The visible artifacts on screen are not meant to convey information about the console's operating system, but instead obscure it. They render visuality into something garbled, messy, and riddled with errors. They prompt the consideration of what it might mean for the errors in the visual systems that we interact with to move beyond the utilitarian and the documentative and into something unprecedented, unable to be predicted by the machine, a cascade of failures that exceed what was previously thought to be possible by the console itself, the hard-coded configurations of the computer system. In Digital TV Dinner, we see these people orientations, a turning toward the human as a site of incomputable errors and possibilities, a turning toward the dissolution of categories, of visualities, in the cascading blocks that loop and repeat and imagine new and unpredictable configurations for themselves with every press of a button and ejection of the cartridge. In an interview from 1982, Fenton appears in a bluish-purple polo shirt. Behind her is a series of televisions, computers, and keyboards, and a makeshift system she uses to play a prototype of Ms. Gorf, a game that today is, quote, sitting in a box on 8-inch floppies because development had to be halted due to the video game crash. In the interview, there are long close-ups of the game playing on the television screen, while in the background, we hear what sounds like a child playing with a toy spaceship. In the audio, these sounds are punctuated by deep breaths. The camera then cuts to an establishing shot of Fenton, face turned away from the camera, looking at the television in the background. We can see the tip of her nose, the side of her right cheek. "We don't have sound yet, so I have to make up my own," she explains, launching into a series of pfs that end with the crashing sound of an explosion. Cathryn Mataga, the lying parser. In the early 1980s, Cathryn Mataga developed a programming language titled BTZ, or Better Than Zork, for the now-defunct video game company Synapse Software. BTZ is a text parser and interactive text language that was used to respond naturally to human language input. Interactive fiction software built with BTZ is notable for its evasive answers, responding to user input it does not understand with a question or a broad statement instead of a flat-out notification that it cannot compute the input, a response that obscures the computer's knowledge or lack thereof. In Mindwheel, an interactive fiction program published in 1982, if you type hello, the program will ask, why not try asking another character? You're talking to yourself again. When you begin the program, you're in a room with Dr. Virgil. You can type out questions for him including, Doctor, what is the nature of life? To which he responds, I'm a little confused. Could you tell me more information? And, Doctor, are you depressed? And the parser responds, I don't know how you could say that about me. Some software designers were critical of Mataga's work. Mark Blank, the chief architect of a rival text parser called ZIL, made by the same company as the Zork that BTZ is better than, this is pretty fascinating, was quoted in a 1985 Computer Entertainment article titled, If Your Computer Can Read This, by Shay Adams. You call that parsing? Blank angrily said when asked about Mataga's parser. He derisively called BTZ the big lie parser. It hardly understands anything, but it fools you into thinking it does. While Blank is positioning what he calls a big lie parser as something inadequate in natural language processing, the lying parser has a long lineage in the history of artificial intelligence. The first artificial intelligence program, ELIZA, produced by Joseph Weizenbaum in 1966 in the MIT's Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. And also this image is actually for a 1979 release of ELIZA for Radio Shack computers, so it's a little different. The original program ELIZA produced in MIT has a script called Doctor that utilized a similar mode of lying or covering up its own lack of comprehension of human language by asking questions instead, a parser that lies to pass for human. ELIZA's Doctor script was designed to mimic the logics of a psychotherapist with the user in the role of a patient. In Weizenbaum's 1966 article in Computational Linguistics titled ELIZA, a computer program for the study of natural language communication between man and machine, he writes about a curious power balance that occurs with the computer moving between concealing and revealing information to the human user. Quote, ELIZA in its use so far has had as one of its principal objectives the concealment of its lack of understanding, but to encourage its conversational partner to offer inputs from which it can select remedial information, it must reveal its misunderstanding, end quote. Weizenbaum later writes that the way that this concealing and revealing of understanding must be transactional, where, to encourage the human user to continue interacting with and submitting data and information to the program, the computer must, as he writes, quote, switch objectives from the concealment to the revelation of misunderstanding, which he sees as a precondition to making an ELIZA-like program for the effective natural language man-machine communication system. A simple example of this, as Adams writes for computer entertainment is, quote, if you type in, I hate my sister, ELIZA will find the keywords hate and sister and then ask, why do you hate your sister? It doesn't really understand what you're trying to say, it doesn't really understand what you're saying the way a traditional parser or orthodox Freudian does. It just turns your words around, end quote. When interacting with a modern day emulation of ELIZA, a similar pattern can be found when typing in the phrase, I hate my sister. When beginning the program with, I hate my sister, ELIZA responds, don't you ever say hello? And continues with a string of questions or open-ended responses after each response. I would like to talk about how I hate my sister, the user might type. I sometimes also want to talk about how you hate your sister. ELIZA responds, do I hate my sister? The user types. Can you elaborate on that? She asks. Weizenbaum writes that this mode of conversation was chosen because the psychiatric interview was one of the few examples of categorized dyadic natural language communication in which one of the participating pair is free to assume the pose of knowing almost nothing of the real world. The process of concealment and transparency between patient and psychiatrist is a power relationship that provided a model for the video game text parsing program's ability to collect information from the user while concealing its logics and intentions, hiding its incapability to fully understand all language and commands from the user. The selective process of disclosing and hiding information from the user and from the patient mimics the relationship between front end and back end of software interaction. That, as users, we're only aware of a certain subset of information that is represented to us in the front end of the interface of the computer screen, and the rest of the processes are hidden or opaque to us, existing in the back end of the software's code. And I thought this was kind of a really awesome thing to have in this article that was published by Weizenbaum. It actually includes the script that goes on in the back end of the ELIZA, I guess, chatbot in robot. This psychiatric interview as a power structure between concealed and hidden was codified and increasingly introduced into medical protocol during this period. We might see here a feedback loop between computational programs like video games and medical diagnostic practices that imagined human patients as so-called users who are not given full access to the back end of diagnostic logic or the code that underlies the medical industrial complex as a system that collects data from patients rather than engages with patients as individuals. Prior to the publishing of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 3, psychiatric diagnosis, quote, focused on psychodynamic explanations that directed attention toward the total personality and life experiences of each individual patient. However, according to June Sprock, with the introduction of the DSM-3, the effort to improve diagnostic reliability was bolstered by the development of structured diagnostic interviews, in which psychiatrists could extract diagnostic data from patients, a practice that coincided with the emergence of computers as medical diagnostic tools in the 1960s. We can see a similar ideological mode of power enacted by the psychiatric interview being used increasingly in human-computer interaction and computational media with the text parser. The big lie parser that Mataga designed was an artificial intelligence that mimicked institutional modes of surveillance of patients with the intent of the computer program to so-called pass for human, a parser that hides its inhumanness and the limitations of computer code to understand human language through histories of artificial intelligence and its ties to diagnostic systems in the medical industrial complex. Danielle Bunten Berry, People Orientations. In a lecture titled Imaginary Playmates in Real Time or Why Online Games Suck at the 1997 Computer Game Developers Conference, which later became GDC, software programmer Danielle Bunten Berry spoke about the limitations of artificial intelligence in online networked multiplayer games. There aren't maybes, she says. There are only zeros and ones. The need for competent AI required the internal models for online games to be computational, which computers love, rather than heuristic, which humans enjoy, end quote. Bunten Berry was best known for designing and programming software that mediated networked interactions between multiple people, games that contained loose rule sets that allowed for the fullness of human error and human possibility. She imagined networked interactions as not preset by hard-coded computational binaries, the zeros and ones that determine the rules of a software system, but instead imagined computers as facilitating interactions that could accommodate for the fullness of human emotion, desire, and intent that could not be detected or fully governed by predetermined computational rule sets or algorithms. In her talk, she imagines the future of online social media as full of heuristic, imperfect, inefficient problem solving and trial and error, a fullness that was often simplified and reduced to zeros and ones in computational systems, a fullness that could accommodate the full possibility of human maybes in human-computer interaction. Bunten Berry was most well known for the computer and console software she programmed that gave people the possibility to move around computational rule sets rather than be constrained by them. Her game, Mule, released in 1983 for the Commodore 64, and I love this game, it's so great, home computer, utilized an open-ended auction system where players walked toward or away from a line in order to inflate or deflate the selling and buying prices of their goods, which resulted in a complex supply and demand system that changed each time the game was played. The flexibility of this auction system allowed players the option to deceive and trick one another into in-game monopolies or collectively lower market price values and, to resources with one another. So it offered a lot of possibilities for how you would regulate the market together. Robot Rascals, released in 1986 for the Commodore 64 and Apple II computers, enacted a complex interplay between an analog card system and a computer, which you can kind of see the cards here, where players could steal, make deals, and bargain with other players using physical cards. And these are some of the cards that are available in that game, which then determined what items they had in the computerized part of the game and how many turns they had to search for items. In a 1998 talk given by Brian Moriarty, who I think was a part of LucasArts, he writes that Bunten Berry's 1979 video game Computer Quarterback, designed for Apple II, quote, was originally designed to support exactly 2 players. In an amusing reversal of recent industry practice, it was the single-player mode that was reluctantly added at the last minute at the request of the publisher, end quote. Throughout her life, Bunten Berry advocated for what she called people orientations in online social interactions in video games, pushing against the reductive way that computer algorithms reduced the nuances of human interactions into data sets and pixels. Quote, what we're experiencing now is just the fact that people make better opponents, she said in her 1997 talk. They will do more interesting things than any algorithm. People can make you feel welcome and accepted. People can teach you and share with you. They can touch you emotionally. But the current online games are nothing but a few pixels on the screen and an occasional stream of text. So I guess what I'm saying is that online games suck in comparison to what they can become. In her work, she pushed against the reduction of human possibility into predetermined data sets and outcomes. She imagined people orientations for computers, where computers didn't simplify the complexity of human interaction, but instead were capable of facilitating more potentials for human possibility, more ways of feeling, more ways of being. And yet, I feel a strange kind of stillness when I look through the archive of her professional papers and design documents collected in the Strong Museum of Play. There are many boxes filled with files and stacks of paper. All of these things have been saved, and still I struggle to piece together a full and complete person in the documents that other people have assembled. I find flashes of her occasionally when I turn a page or open a folder. In her tight and looped handwriting, there is a moment where Bunten Berry writes about her day and her experience being misgendered by a postal worker, saved because it is on the same page as her last will and testament. A moment where Bunten Berry writes about the process of disclosing her transgender identity to hospital staff. It is in these fleeting moments that I find her, and I imagine how she animated the documents and set them in motion. I try to imagine her as a set of verbs that did and saw and felt, rather than a carefully curated set of facts and documents, sitting motionless in a folder, in a box, in an archive. I recently heard Bunten Berry's voice for the first time in a digitized cassette recording of a talk she gave at the Computer Game Developers Conference in 1998. In it, she is full of actions and verbs, and she moves me. Her voice is hoarse. She takes short breaths. Her talk is interspersed with coughs. She has a markedly Southern accent. She occasionally uses the word ain't. She talks candidly about her pronoun change. She makes jokes to Sid Meier and other game developer friends in the audience. After so much time searching for her, for the first time I can hear her. She presents herself with absolute certainty. She talks about the possible future for online network games, predicting the multi-billion-dollar industry we know today. She predicts iterative development in games, where developers can update and make tweaks to their games after release. She predicts that games will turn away from the one-time only game purchases and move toward in-game advertising and payments in small increments. 1998. It's pretty amazing, which we can see now in massively multiplayer online games and subscription services. She criticizes single-player games for their inability to fully embrace the complexity of imperfect heuristic rule systems that humans so love and computers suck so bad at, she says. In her talk, she animates herself. She sets into motion all of the objects and documents I've encountered in her archive. I see her for the first time as a self-guided movement, a whirlwind. She speaks pointedly about actions, what she calls orientations toward computers and the dynamics processes that animate us when we play games. She talks about possibilities that propel the future of games forward, looking toward a great and impossibly vast future for multiplayer games, full of potential. This talk was given in May 1998. When she finishes speaking, she thanks the audience and takes the microphone off. The recording ends. Bunten Berry passed away from lung cancer 2 months later, in July of that year. This is likely the last recording we have of her. When I finish the recording, it is like saying goodbye for the last time. I locate Bunten Berry as a force, as the site of this turn toward digital sociality and online games. I locate her as this action, the movement, and the locus of orientations she advocates for in her belief in what online video games could be, not a reduction of human life into information and data, but an expansion of it. Throughout her work, I imagine her turning, acting, and moving, asking us to move and turn with her, to see things differently, to see this future she imagined for us in our everyday interactions with network games today. If we recognize that our orientations toward computers are something that have a history, we might be able to celebrate Bunten Berry every time we engage with a computer or play an online multiplayer game, rather than struggle to find her in the static documents and files and folders that happen to be saved in the archive. In acknowledging the limitations of the archive and how it can carefully regiment what is kept and what is lost, we can locate our queer and trans elders in places we might not expect, in the actions we perform, in the possibilities they imbue into our networked interactions with computers. If we destabilize technological history's focus on objects and documents and rethink it as histories of actions and interactions, we might be able to reframe our interactions with technology as a celebration of queer and trans life. These three women, Jamie Faye Fenton, Cathryn Mataga, and Danielle Bunten Berry, present us with new possibilities for reading queer and trans life into software history, and also histories of video games. Instead of relying on a vertical and chronological trajectory of so-called technological progress and its objects and patrilineal founders, I locate queer and trans life in software history through a horizontal cut in time. Histories of video games and histories of queer and transgender life and policy can seem miles apart because of disciplinary tendencies to isolate the study of video games and interactive media from the histories and lived experiences of queer and transgender people, people of color, and marginalized individuals. This disciplinary cleaving of video games from queer, feminist, and transgender concerns presents us with a great loss. We lose sight of the full material and historical circumstances that shaped contemporary technologies, especially technologies that are so everyday we forget their mediation. In all of my work, I ask myself how we can write about queer and trans life in histories of digital media when queer and trans lives have been purposefully excised from the archive and removed from discussions of histories of technology. The way we write video game history could decentralize objects and allow us to read queer and trans life in more places than just what is represented and saved for us, in the actions and orientations that permeate all of our modes of understanding and interacting with games. The act of writing queer and trans histories of games gives us the possibility of reading history as something alive that churns, sets in motion, breathes life into, and animates the objects and documents that have been saved, as well as those that have been lost. It gives us the possibility of locating queer and trans life in histories of video games as a genealogy, instead of an incongruous dot in the timeline without a past and without a future. We might find a continuous line across time where queer and trans people have always been, seeing, feeling, acting, and moving us forward. Thank you very much. So as a part of this sort of genealogy that I talk about, as a queer and trans game designer, I'm also really invested and interested in how we can kind of locate these queer and trans actors and designers in our history and connect it to this extremely robust and exciting queer and trans game dev scene that's happening right now. And I'm sure there's many of you who know about this and are involved in it, and it's very exciting. So in 2018, I designed a video game titled Digital TV Breakfast, and this is actually a screenshot from the game. I developed it in Unity. I made a 3D model of the Bally Astrocade, which is really cool, and also a little cartridge of the Bally Basic that Jamie Fenton basically programmed. And to give some kind of background for this, I was commissioned to design this for an art exhibition titled Chicago New Media 1973 to 1992, and it was exhibited at Gallery 400. So a professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, John Cates, who works on glitch art, curated this whole exhibition, and I could choose whatever I wanted in the whole exhibition to design a game around. And as soon as I found Jamie Faye Fenton's Digital TV Dinner, I was like, this is the one. This is amazing. This is like, it's almost like finding, a relative in sort of the archive, and I was so incredibly drawn to it. So this art exhibition also, as I mentioned earlier, went to Ars Electronica in Linz, Austria, and so I was just really thrilled to have John include my game in that exhibit as a way to kind of look at these sort of continuities of Chicago new media art across history from the 1970s to now. And I wanted to include a few screenshots so you can kind of see a close-up of the Bally that I designed in the game. These sorts of like centralizing domestic spaces and home spaces is really important for me, especially because the Bally itself was, as I mentioned briefly, the cheapest home computer for like 6 months, according to Jamie. And so it made digital art and glitch art accessible to like people in their homes during this period. And then you can kind of see additional screenshots of this as the glitch starts taking over the environment. And then here. And I wanted to include a few screenshots, or this is what the it looked like in the exhibition space, which is kind of cool. You have a lot of screens going on. And then also, I'm just so happy about this. Jamie actually lives in Chicago, and she came to my art exhibition. I was like, oh my goodness. She came specifically. I think John told her that I made this game, and she played the game. And I basically was like, oh, you use like the mouse and the keyboard. And she was like, I don't know how to do this, but figured it out almost instantaneously when I explained it to her. She's like, and she also like knew exactly what I was doing in terms of like video rendering textures and stuff in the game. But she is a lovely, lovely, lovely human being, and I was just so thrilled to have that experience of being able to meet her and have her sit in on me giving a little talk about it and have her play my game, and it really meant so much to me. So I'm going to do a live demonstration of this game. I have it here on my computer, so you can kind of get a sense of sort of.
This piece represents.
do that. There we go.
This piece represents the absolute cheapest one can go in home computer art. This involves taking a $300 video game system, pounding it with your fist so the cartridge pops out while it's trying to write the menu.
You can see there's like
The music here is done by Dick Ainsworth using the same system, but pounding it with your fingers instead of your fist.
You start noticing things repeating. A few of the things I wanted to show you also was Bally, which I actually used Bally Alley sort of like images of the Bally as like the buttons and stuff, so there are images there. And the game itself is like, or the image itself is an actual video of the game, or of the original glitch art piece. And then lastly, I have a little Commodore 64 here. Actually, it was in, I put it in there as a sort of like homage to Danielle Bunten Berry. But then when I met Jamie, she was like, "Oh, I also designed. I programmed games for the Commodore too." So it was kind of like wonderful having these sort of intersecting histories of like the different consoles a lot of these women designed for and programmed software for. But one of the things I was really interested in was how this video had so many repetitions and loops and this sort of like uncanny returning to things, and I was interested in making that happen inside of home spaces. The only control also that you can do to make anything happen in the game is clicking, and when you click, you just look even harder. So, a lot of people ask me questions about this too. They're like, "Oh, why did you decide to make this clicking? Like, why can't you click more?" And I was like, well, I wanted you to move through the space. I wanted motion and movement to be important, more important than the act of you changing something or clicking to affect something. Just because I feel like video game space really needs to be decolonized in some ways, like really think it through. Like, what does it mean when we enter into a game space and we expect to change it and control it? But what does it mean if you are playing a game and your only action is being able to move through the space? And also look harder, I guess. So, yeah. As you can see here, you start seeing the glitches kind of appear more and more in all the objects. The last area.
Computer art. This involves taking a $300
you can kind of see the whole area being subsumed by the glitch.
While it's trying to write the menu.
But
the music here is done by Dick Ainsworth.
I think there's something really important in locating queer and trans life and history in domestic spaces. Like we don't think about that. Like she was such an important figure in terms of how she developed this console that made like programming and glitch art supposedly more accessible to people. Although, like, you know, if you attended the Arcadians talk, you can kind of see that it was not a commercial success. But there's this intent behind it that I feel very strongly about. Like what Kevin and Rachel were speaking about, they were saying, you know, even throughout all this whole process, Jamie was very, very active with like homebrew communities in terms of making things accessible to people, to make the code accessible, to make these sorts of things accessible. So there's something important about locating queer and trans life in domestic spaces, and this idea of accessibility, making programming and video art and game design accessible inside of people's homes, really important, especially when we think about the history of video games as being you know, like a lot of canonical ways of just talking about video game history is about the military-industrial complex. You think about Tennis for Two, a lot of these things that emerged from military, you know, funding and stuff like that. So what does it mean to think about queer and trans life as being the continuous force for video game history? How can we reorient who matters and what spaces matter when we think about people like Jamie Faye Fenton, who were the first to design things, but also were like huge and important figures in these sorts of histories that are not, and they're not really, people aren't really writing about people like Jamie Faye Fenton, Cathryn Mataga, and Danielle Bunten Berry in larger histories of like network games or text parsers. I was so surprised to find that I hadn't heard of some of these people before when I was doing this research, when I first started doing this research. So what does it mean to write the histories that people have been kind of like not wanting to write about, or people had been kind of writing about in ways that are potentially homophobic and transphobic too, where people cite and talk about queer and trans people in ways that are potentially harmful in terms of misgendering or using the wrong pronouns. Like how do we write a history that's reparative? How do we think about history as being something that that queer and trans people can take, and we can be the ones to kind of move it along and be the ones to kind of pass it along and frame it as our history, something that we can like have and hold and pass along to others for the future. So that's a large part of my own research is how do we do that? How do we find these things? And I'm very happy to have been able to do that in both my scholarly research and my research in history, but also through game design. And I'm hoping to maybe like continue this video game series about locating queer and trans people in video game and software history through like some kind of like also play and design aspect of this project too. So I just want to thank you all for coming here. Yeah, as I said before, I really appreciate all of your presences here, given how busy the whole MAGFest thing is. But if anyone has any, also this is my first MAGFest, so this is actually very exciting. Yeah. I'm having a really great time. Okay, so does anyone have any questions? I think we have like 10 minutes. Or comments?
You did good.
Oh, thank you. Nice. Thank you. Yeah, this whole, in the back.
Please do this again next year.
Oh, thank you so much, so much, so much. Oh, yeah. Thank you. That feedback really means so much. My research is expanding. I'm doing a lot more like oral histories with people and stuff like that, so I would be excited to come back again, if invited, yeah. Oh, yes.
Is your research mostly focused on like that era, like the belly after late 70s, 80s, or have you been researching more different time spans than just that one segment?
Thanks for that question. So basically about whether or not I'm focusing on the 1970s and 1990s, or if it expands beyond that. So I would have to say that like my interest is in queer media specifically. So one of the things I write about too is contemporary queer video games, and video games made by queer and trans people today too. So, and kind of trying to link up the logics and kind of modes of resistance that exist in like contemporary queer games, and how we can see our like elders having already done that work also in the past. So I see this as kind of like this particular project is in that chunk of time, but I kind of imagine the sort of like queer games movement that's happening right now as like a kind of framing for understanding these sorts of histories. So because I just feel like one of the sad things about like, you know, if we don't look at these histories, then how do we know who came before us? How do we know what people were thinking and feeling? I feel like it's really important to be like, oh, the work that I do now as a queer game designer, that is like something that's just, people have been doing this before me, and I find comfort in that in some ways. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for your question. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if your understanding of the importance of locating queer lived reality in home spaces. Well, no, if that wasn't put by queer phenomenology or Sarah.
Oh, yeah.
That looks so good.
Oh, yeah. Yep, that's a really good question. So we're talking about the experience of queer bodies. There's a kind of like academic sort of like discussion of queer embodiment that people like Sarah Ahmed have been writing about. She wrote a book called Queer Phenomenology. And her book is amazing. So if any of you are interested in sort of like scholarly stuff and embodiment, I think it's just a brilliant book because it's about this idea of queer bodies especially fitting differently into spaces and feeling differently in terms of comfort, in terms of discomfort, and how that all relates to a lot of like larger social issues. So I do think a lot about that. The idea of like, you know, queer bodies experience homes differently. Queer bodies experience public spaces differently. So what is it, how subversive is it? How meaningful is it to have queer bodies inside of homes? Like, what does it mean to for queer bodies to find comfort in homes? Like, how is that actually responding to the ways that discomfort has manifested in the way we can't always take safety and comfort for granted in all the spaces we occupy? So thanks for the question. Yeah, that's something I think about a lot with this too, because like, one of the essays I really loved in the past several years that was published is Lane Nooney's A Pedestal, a Love Letter, a table. There we go, thank you. A table, is it a table, a pedestal, a love letter? Yeah, but like Lane is actually coming tonight to the video game Hot Sauce Gauntlet, but she's a video game historian who works on Sierra Online, but like her essay was about the kitchen table as being this like site of history, and that was one of the reasons why I started with a kitchen table. I thought that was really important. Like, how do we pay attention to all these spaces that people don't document and people don't think are important when we do history? Yeah.
Can you speak on like the parallel between the trans and queer experience and like with the queer voice and feels of something like digital TV dinner, where errors and aberrations are treated as gifts and as a positive thing that shouldn't be seen as unwanted?
Yes, that's a really great question. Thank you. Whenever I think about that, it makes me want to cry. I was like, oh my goodness. Especially like how she's like, oh, I don't know what we did to deserve that one. Oh, it's just so lovely. Because, you know, we think about like RNG, you're like, oh my goodness, I failed this role, or like there's a glitch in this game and that's like, so it's preventing me from doing something. I think there's just something incredibly beautiful in the fact that she designed the operating system. She knows what it's capable of doing inside and out. She knows everything about it, and yet she uses the glitch as a way to think about software as being able to surprise you, to like come up with possibilities that she could not even imagine as the creator of the game or any kind of software. She actually has a YouTube channel where she actually still designs software programs and then produces glitches in them. So it's like an interest that she's held on to from the 1970s to now. So I like highly recommend looking at her like glitch art that she creates, because like it's not just about creating the glitch, it's also knowing what you need to do to produce this unknowable error that I think is just incredibly beautiful. But yeah, there's something important in this idea of software as not necessarily being about documenting something. Software is not necessarily being about having control of a particular thing, but instead treating software as a sort of thing that is possible of all of these unprecedented possibilities that I find so incredibly thoughtful and beautiful about her work. And I take that with me when I think about my own life, like my own gender identity, my sexuality, all of this stuff. Like, what does it mean to cherish all of these things when, you think about RNG and people complaining about how bad, like this randomness of errors are. Like, what does it mean if we flip that on its head and we imagine other possibilities for that? That's really important, I think. Yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm.
That actually reminds me of the talk I was just at with, I don't know if you're familiar with Rango AC or TaskBot. Basically, he has this robot that runs games on physical consoles with essentially the precision of a machine. So you can do frame perfect inputs, you can do all kinds of things that humans normally don't have the like reflexes or physical capabilities to do. Yeah. And in the emulated versions of these consoles, you can achieve these incredibly precise, like perfect speed runs that make mincemeat out of a game in minutes that would normally take you hours. And he started off that talk by saying, welcome, this is this is a panel about failure. And he essentially went through all of the ways that trying to reproduce these runs on physical consoles fails for reasons that we don't fully comprehend yet, and how relevant that is for console preservation. So that just reminds me of that, how physical things can surprise us in interesting ways, even 30 years after they were first created.
Yeah, I kind of love that note of the idea that we don't even know how some of these things work, and that's like an increasingly important part of like, especially like queer technology studies. That's a thing that's growing right now, where people are trying to be like, well, how can we like obscure stuff? How can technology obscure identities on purpose or by accident? How can technology make things unknown? Because there's this increasing like rhetoric around technologies like as being documentative, as being like, oh, the algorithm knows you, and it knows you so well it can recommend this thing to you, or insert all of your information into Facebook or whatever, and having your identity be like completely laid out and known to the technology is like kind of ideal in some ways. So in another way, like thinking about like how does technology do stuff, or how does the glitch and all these things do things that we just can't know? How do we find power in that? How do we find like our identities as like queer and trans people as being unknowable or unknown and full of potential because it's unknown? How can we find that as a site of empowerment? So that's an important part of some of the things I'm thinking through with my own work.
First, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you.
One of the biggest takeaways from this has been sort of a lot of the media I've heard write about sort of queerness, struggle, queerness is coming. And when you're breaking things and you're seeing these reactions that you don't expect, there's sort of this sense of play that's a lot more present and more structured games that are very linear when you're breaking and exploring. And I really like that, like, queerness is the sense of unknown and sort of lends itself to that sense of play. And that was a perspective that I didn't have coming to this, so it's really exciting.
Thank you so much. That feedback really means a lot. Yeah, I've been trying to find how we find hopefulness in queer and trans games and queer and trans histories of computing, and how do we find like potential. And one of the things that really struck me when I was looking through all of these archival works is just like a lot of these women were trying to find something just like beyond what could be findable, and it's just incredibly beautiful. Like even with Danielle Bunten Berry at the end of the talk, she's just interested in being like, I am tired of, she actually writes about this, I'm tired of Diablo, and how like when you're playing multiplayer Diablo, you're just like, you're using one to use your item or whatever, but like it's hard coding what you can do in the game. And what she was interested in was like, how can you like fool people, or how can you have different market prices? How can you have this complexity that you can't have when you just have like press 1 for potion, that kind of thing. So yeah, I in all my work, I'm trying to find that hopefulness, this sort of outside of the predetermined limits of, the computational, especially because when you think about it, some of my other work also looks at the sort of history of computers as being in relationship to this history of medicine too. So you have this increasing like way that queer and trans people specifically were becoming like, we were becoming diagnoses in the medical industrial complex during the period when computers were emerging. So how do computers actually, because if we look at them together, how do computers reflect these sorts of institutional knowledges, and how when these women are like, I think these computers like are too codified, they know too much, we need to look outside of them, how that was also a critique of medical systems, how there's a critique of legal systems. And that's a large part of my own research that it was like, I was thinking about getting into here, but I was like, let's focus on the games, but I'm glad you all are here to kind of hear this little addendum here. But yeah, so we can kind of think about it as being not just about games, but about how do queer and trans people, how do we live in the United States, in this world, with all of these institutional systems, and how do we find our way in and out of them? That's important too.
Yeah, I think you really struck the nail on the head with the concept of the glitch and how it relates to queer and trans life specifically. And I'm a trans woman myself, and looking back at my own life and at all of the trans women I've known who've made contributions to computing and to the gaming industry, not just the one you mentioned, also Berger Becky Heinemann, Jennifer Diane Rice, etc. there's always this element of thinking outside the box. And I think
Yes.
that to come to terms with yourself as being something that a lot of people deny even exists, you kind of have to be able to do nonlinear thinking.
Yes.
Like, when I was a child, for example, I had a game, The Bard's Tale, which it turns out was done by Herbert Becky, who also worked on Test Times in Town Town, another game which was really out there and in this way that sort of resonated with me. But anyways, I found that I could import a save from a non-existent version of it. I told it, okay, I've got a save from Bard's Tale 3. I didn't have a save from Bard's Tale 3, I had a save from Bard's Tale 1. He told it, interpret a 1 save as a 3 save. You got these amazing glitches. The characters would have random numbers and letters in their name. They'd have like 9999 HP and like glitched out items you could sell for $1 million gold. I was experimenting with this just like a
Yes.
kid in the 80s. And it's like, I found every trans technologist I know has that sort of intuitive, think outside the box mentality. And that's really something positive, something
Yes.
that can contribute a lot to the world.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. That was lovely.
Thank you for your talk.
Oh, thank you.
More like this. More like
Oh, I have so much to say about this. So, it would, and my research just continues to grow. So I'm hoping for more chances to like come back here and do more of these talks, and also hear people like you who are like have such wonderful things to add to this. Because I completely agree. All these women were doing some beautiful things with technology. You were doing beautiful things with technology, like when we were like, how do you think about these systems and their rule sets? How do we imagine something else?
we're
And
essentially hackers of our own identities.
yes, that is beautiful. Hackers of our own identities. I think that's absolutely right. Like, how do we hack this system? It's beautiful. Thank you.
What advice would you give to like young queer trans people who want to kind of like trailblaze and go into like thinking outside the box and breaking some of the boundaries and doing their own research?
Well, thank you for that question. Let's see. So, one of the things that really helped me like think about how to think outside the box was actually looking at games on itch.io. Really just amazing. Like, for instance, I don't know a lot of code. I don't know how to code a lot. But when I designed this with Unity, I was actually using the tools that I knew how to do. I'm a graphic designer. So like, when I was like, you can filter for like different types of games that are like walking simulators or other games where it doesn't require a ton of code, and then you can discover all these fascinating and strange and different and outside of the box thinking that a lot of those game designers use for like something as simple as like, a point from like where you click on something, you move to a different point or a different room, and people have used that in ingenious ways. So I think itch.io, if you're a game designer, is really beautiful and wonderful, so you can kind of see what is possible with a limited amount of like, I guess like a limited amount. So it's like AAA games give you so many options, they give you maybe too many options. So what I love about itch.io is that it takes one or two things and does them incredibly well in incredibly unexpected ways. And I found that to be such a beautiful hub for queer game design, just learning about what's possible and what's impossible too. In terms of like scholarship and stuff, I started off as like a queer game studies person, and I wanted to just write about all of these games because I was just like, oh my goodness, they're speaking to me. They're about me. I have never felt this way before. And that was like what drew me to doing this. And at that time, it was like, I don't know, like early 2000s, where I was just like, oh, I didn't know you could write about games. And like queer games specifically, and have them be meaningful. So one of my other pieces of advice is like, if you're drawn to something because it speaks to you, that's important. Like, that is real. That is like, what is it? The personal is political in some ways. So like, if you find a piece of media or a game that you love and it speaks to you as like a queer or trans person or person of color, it's meaningful, and you can write something about it, and you can share that with other people. And I think that if you take that with you, I don't know how I got here, but it's like so funny. Like, I am now going to be a professor of queer and transgender media studies at NYU. And I'm just like, whoa, that's incredible. So, like, more and more I'm finding that queer and trans people and our histories and the things that we produce are being more and more valued by people, by professors, by conferences like this. So it's exciting. As you're moving forward, there's so many more opportunities that will happen too, I think. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.